Good morning, everybody. I'm Naomi DeWinter, and I serve as the president of this fine institution in its 90th year this year. And welcome to our presentation led by Dr. Kedrowski. I just want to remind you that 2020 2020 represents the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment.
Could be with that. Check 1, 2.
So, as I was saying, 2020 represents the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, allowing women equal rights to vote. The suffragist movement resulted in passage of the 19th Amendment in the U.S. Congress in June of 1919, with ratification in August 1 year later. Iowa was the 10th state to ratify. And in commemoration of this momentous event, our guest speaker today will kick off a series of events over the next year, both here at the college and within the community. Dr. Kedrowski is director of the Carrie, Chapman, Catt Center for Women and Politics and professor of political science at Iowa State University. The Catt Center conducts research on women and politics with a focus on Iowa and promotes civic engagement. She has assumed this role just recently in January of 2019. Dr. Kedrowski is a graduate of the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and the University of Oklahoma, Norman. Her research agenda focuses primarily on women and politics and civic engagement. Prior to coming to Iowa State, she spent 24 years at Winthrop University in Rock Hill, South Carolina, where she served in many roles, including Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and as a key leader of the university's civic and voter engagement efforts. She also received Winthrop's highest faculty honor, Distinguished Professor, in 2011. This event is being live streamed to our other campuses in Bettendorf, Davenport, and Clinton. And I especially want to thank Jeff Kaufman's U.S. History and Political Science students for being here, the members of United League of Women, and all of our community members who have joined us today. So please help me welcome Dr. Karen Kedrowski.
Thank you, Dr. DeWinter, and thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us here today. It's a real pleasure to be here in Muscatine. I make sort of a small personal hobby out of visiting the Mississippi River at different points in its journey. I grew up in central Minnesota, actually in the town of Little Falls, which has a strong tie to the Muzzer family, just as Muscatine does. And trust me when I say that the river is a good deal smaller there. So anyway, it's just great to be here. And I want to thank, too, a big shout out to Professor Kaufman for inducing his students to come. I know he told that his students, or told me that many of his students actually are studying the first half of American history, and I'm happy to tell you that actually the story of suffrage fits in nicely with that part of the course. So a little bit about the suffrage movement. We date the suffrage movement from 1848, but actually its origins are even somewhat earlier. Of the two women that you see on the screen in front of you, on your far right is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who are both pictured here, were active in the abolition movement. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton accompanied her husband and the family friends, including Lucretia Mott, to an international abolitionist conference in London in 1840. Elizabeth Stanton attended as an observer, and Lucretia Mott was actually elected as a delegate from the United States. And this through the fact that the United States was cheeky enough to elect a woman as a delegate to an international abolitionist conference, threw the conference into turmoil for about 2 days because they had to figure out what to do with these women who showed up. And what they ended up deciding to do after significant debate was that they allowed the women to sit in the balcony behind a curtain and listen to the debates, but they could not participate, including Mrs. Mott, who was actually an elected delegate. So Mrs. Stanton and Mrs. Mott sat there and fumed, as you can imagine, and decided that slaves were not the only people who were in some need of liberation. And the seeds of the Seneca Falls Conference were planted at that point. And it took some time for them to be able to pull it together. You know, life gets in the way. But they called a women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, which was not actually the first gathering that began to talk about social reforms for women, but it was the first one of significant note. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in preparation of this 2-day conference, penned the Declaration of Sentiments. And the language of this is actually quite familiar to students of American history and government. It starts with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." And goes on in the pattern of the Declaration of Independence to list what they see as the grievances of men who hold power against women in society at the time, and to list a number of reforms related to divorce law, property ownership, the ability to hold and earn wages and retain those wages, child custody. But the single most contentious issue that was included in this Declaration of Sentiments, and the one that actually meant that about half of the attendees refused to sign the final document, was a call for women's right to vote, for women's suffrage. So that was just considered sort of too extreme, too public, too much to ask for. The other reforms really focused on women as individuals within the family and their ability to maintain their wages and to maintain the safety of their children. This one really sort of thrust women into the public sphere. After this convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton became one of the primary intellectual forces of the women's suffrage movement. And a few years after the convention, she met Susan B. Anthony and Mrs. Stanton recruited Susan B. Anthony into the suffrage movement. Anthony herself was a Quaker, as were many of the people involved in this movement, and she was also an ardent abolitionist. And she became the most notable, prominent face of the suffrage movement in the pre-Civil War period. She traveled the country, usually in the spring, summer, and fall when the weather was a little bit more cooperative. She was known for wearing black silk dresses and a red silk shawl, and she carried a bag that kind of looks like a doctor's medicine bag, but that was her piece of luggage. And all of these were her signature items. And as she was caricatured in the media, or there were pictures or any descriptions of her, she was always in this uniform, and that became synonymous with her identity. Susan B. Anthony was single, unmarried, did not have children. Or Elizabeth Cady Stanton had 6 children to raise. So Elizabeth Stanton wrote the documents, came up with the arguments, helped craft the speeches, and then Susan B. Anthony traveled the country advocating for suffrage. Anthony never knew how she was going to be greeted. She said that she could tell that public opinion was turning when she was pelted with fresh tomatoes and fruits, as opposed to ones that were rotten. And when the hecklers were more humorous than vicious. But she didn't know if one person or 1,000 people would show up when she spoke. She didn't know if she would be greeted with animosity and hostility or welcomed. But it certainly took an enormous amount of personal character and bravery to continue going forward. When the Civil War came along, again, because of the close ties between the abolition movement and the equal rights, the suffrage movement, the suffrage advocates were really in favor of the Civil War because of its central moral question around slavery, and in fact, so many of these people were actually prominent in both movements. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman were all prominent African Americans who were actually also involved in the women's suffrage movement. And at the end of the Civil War, though, there was a significant disagreement over the Reconstruction amendments. So after the Civil War, there were 3 constitutional amendments that were added to our governing document. The 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment, which does a whole lot of things, including having a process by which people who had served in the Confederate Army could be reinstated with their citizenship to the Union, but also very importantly includes due process and equal protection clauses for the protections for citizens, and then the 15th Amendment, which is a voting rights amendment. There were 2 points of contention. The first one is that the 14th Amendment was restricted to males. For the first time, there was a gender-specific term that was added to the Constitution. So a careful reading of the 14th Amendment says that it protects males' rights of due process and equal protection. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony really objected to this because they did not want the word male added. They wanted to make sure that these protections were available to all citizens. So elsewhere in the document, you see words like electors, meaning voters. You see representatives, senators. They're gender-neutral terms, and here we have a gender-specific term. And that had implications for the 15th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment says that the right to vote shall not be abridged on the basis of condition of race or condition of former servitude, right? So it by itself is not restricted to one sex or another, but because of the word male in the 14th Amendment, the implication clearly was, and its advocates were absolutely, embraced this, restricted the right to vote to African American males. So the women's suffrage movement then split over the 15th Amendment. Stanton and Anthony wanted the 15th Amendment to not be sex-specific and to actually include sex as one way as one guarantee of the right to vote. So they wanted it to be sex, race, and former condition of servitude. Another branch of the movement, led by Lucy Stone and Lucretia Mott, was willing to sacrifice and take out the word sex. And the argument was made, it is the black man's turn. And their argument was that using the Constitution to guarantee the right to vote was a fairly dramatic departure. The Constitution otherwise clearly specifies that the time, place, and manner of elections is the function of the states. So here you have the federal government moving in on an area that is normally a function of the states. And that they did not think that if sex were included in the 15th Amendment that it had any chance of being ratified. So it was a political expediency decision that women should be dropped. Rightly or wrongly, right, this led to a split in the movement, where Stanton and Anthony created the National Women's Suffrage Association, and Stone and Mott created the American Women's Suffrage Association. The movement remained split for about 20 years, until 1890. At this point, Stanton and Anthony are reaching the end of their public careers. They are well into their 80s. They are, aging, and they realize that they need to replace themselves because the movement is going to be entering yet another generation. And one of the proteges of Susan B. Anthony is pictured here, and that is Carrie Chapman Catt of Charles City, Iowa, graduate of the Iowa Agricultural College in 1880, which is now Iowa State University. And even though it's unpopular to say this in this part of the state, go Cyclones. Okay. 1890 is actually a fairly critical year for the women's suffrage movement. So first thing is that under the leadership of Susan B. Anthony, the two branches of the women's suffrage movement have been merged. So instead of having, now this is confusing, stay with me. Instead of having the National Women's Suffrage Movement and the American Women's Suffrage Association, you have now the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Like, that's not confusing. Otherwise referred to as NASA. And they rejoined forces in 1890. Carrie Chapman Catt became president of this organization, and this was the foremost women's suffrage organization from 1890 through 1920. She became president from 1900 to 1904, and then for a variety of personal reasons, she stepped away from the presidency and then reassumed the presidency in 1915. She remained president of the organization until it dissolved, which was well after 1920. But the really crucial years were 1915 to 1920. In her second presidency, so from 1915 to 1920, is when Carrie Chapman Catt crafted her winning plan for suffrage. Now, if you recall, a few minutes ago, I said that that the 15th Amendment was really a rather radical departure because for the first time the Constitution was saying something about who exactly should be given the right to vote, right? Well, that debate continued. It continued, and in fact, it continued within the suffrage movement. So the American Women's Suffrage Association argued that women should be granted the right to vote by state action, that they should advocate on a state-by-state level and enact it into state law or state constitutions. The National Women's Suffrage Association argued that it should be done, again, by another constitutional amendment, that women should be enfranchised through a constitutional amendment. What Carrie Chapman Catt did with this merger was to say, we're going to do both. Now, why? Okay, 1890 is also interesting because it is the year that Wyoming comes into the nation as a state. It is granted statehood, and in its statehood petition, they specifically specify that women will have the right to vote. They also had the right to vote in Wyoming Territory prior to statehood. So now you have the first state that has granted women the right to vote. And as Carrie Chapman Catt sees it, as states enfranchise women by the right to vote, and actually shortly after Wyoming, a number of other western states did the same thing: Colorado, Utah, Montana. So as western states were beginning to enfranchise, what that meant that if women were enfranchised by state action, that would bind their congressional delegations to support the federal amendment. So if you work towards a federal amendment and towards state action, you're going to end up being able to pull together the coalition that you need to enact a constitutional amendment, which will do two things. Number one, it will make sure that any women who are enfranchised by state action don't lose their right to vote by state action, right? Women were first actually granted the right to vote in New Jersey in the late 1600s. And then they lost it after by state action. But the second thing is that then it would expand and the right to vote beyond one state to another, so beyond state borders to the national. Everybody with me so far? Any questions? Okay. Just to keep things interesting, though, as we go into the circle and come into the last 5 years of the suffrage movement, we find that the movement splits again. And this is a picture of Alice Paul, who founded the National Women's Party in 1917. And Alice Paul, who started her activism within the Nassau organization, actually during the period when Carrie Catt had stepped away from the presidency, she ended up representing a still younger generation of suffrage leaders. And she was much more militant and disagreed with the leadership about exactly how suffragists should advocate. What Paul wanted was to skip worrying about state action altogether. She thought that it was inefficient and insecure, and what she wanted was a federal amendment, and a federal amendment only, and to concentrate all of the suffrage efforts to lobbying in Congress. Alice Paul is a really interesting character. She is the first woman who earned a PhD in political science in the United States. So as a political scientist, I think that's kind of cool. And that was fairly, early in the discipline's history, somewhere around 1902. She too was a Quaker, and after she finished her graduate program, she went to England to study there, and she became involved with the Pankhursts, the Pankhurst family, who were the leading suffragists in Great Britain. Now, the interesting thing about the British suffrage movement, for anybody who has ever watched the movie Suffragette, is that they had a real radical wing to it. The women who were involved in the suffrage movement were much more prone to violence. They would have actually violent demonstrations. They would break windows and throw stones, and one woman even committed suicide by standing in front of the king's horse in a horse race, and she was trampled to death, and did it as a way of calling attention to the suffrage movement. So a number of these women were jailed, and when they went to jail, they protested their imprisonment by hunger striking. So Alice Paul actually hung out with these people and became rather radicalized herself, except that she eschewed the violence, but she agreed with the militancy. So when she came back to the United States and became involved in the suffrage movement, she brought this militancy with her. And as the country moved into World War I, the suffrage movement faced something of a dilemma. They were essentially told, stop worrying about suffrage, don't advocate for this. What we really need to do is focus on the war effort, support our troops, and work to make the world safe for democracy. And when we're all done doing that, we can come back and talk about suffrage again. both Carrie, Chapman, Catt, and Alice Paul were worried about this. They really thought that this would mean that there would lead to an end of, or a loss of momentum for women's suffrage. So Carrie Catt's answer to that was, women are smart enough to do more than one thing, right? So suffragists can talk about suffrage, and we can support the war effort. So the suffragists would get together and they'd roll bandages and raise money and have victory gardens or whatever it was that they were doing, and still talk about why they needed the right to vote, right? Alice Paul said, she's a peace advocate too, right? She's a Quaker, and she goes, I don't care about the war. I'm just going to talk about suffrage, and that's all we are going to do. So this led to, once again, a split in the suffrage movement between Alice Paul and Carrie Catt. The two were not fond of each other. Let's just throw that out there. Okay. And Alice Paul began to organize pickets around the White House. This was the first time there was any sort of protest in American history organized outside the White House. The first time. Now, if you go to Washington, D.C., there's somebody out there banging a drum every single day. It's just a question of what are you protesting about today? So now it's very common, it's been routinized the whole bit. At the time, it was considered radical and treasonous. So women would line up outside the White House fence from morning until afternoon, so a good 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, and stand in silence and hold banners. And the banners that they held, which were brightly colored, the suffragists adopt the colors of gold, purple, and white. And on these, they would often quote President Wilson, quote President Wilson's own speeches about fighting for democracy, the importance of voting rights, and why the United States was a beacon of freedom for the world, and point out that half of the population could not vote. At one point, they organized a protest in Lafayette Park across Pennsylvania Avenue, where Alice Paul read the president's speeches and then burned them in a trash barrel, pointing out the hypocrisy of this. This was not a popular move. And especially after the United States was in World War I, it became an enormous embarrassment. There was actually an effort to bring up charges of treason for the language that the women were using and the language on the banners. And it was pointed out that the words were actually that of President Wilson. So calling the president's own words in favor of World War I treasonous might be slightly problematic. They also did not receive any protection from the police, so they were often attacked. They were dragged away. There were a lot of angry words exchanged. Their banners were torn down and ripped. And then starting in late summer, the women were arrested. Over 250 women who were protesting were arrested, and they were sent to the Occoquan work camp in Northern Virginia. And this was late summer, and it gets a little warm and humid in Washington in the late summer, especially since the area is in fact a swamp. And they were held in a building with the windows closed. They were forced to they were forced to work for 12 hours a day at forced labor. They were fed food that was inedible. It had maggots in it, and it was stretched with sawdust. And they were denied the ability to wear their own clothes. They were given prison attire. And the women protested and said that they were political prisoners, and under the rules of international rules at the time, political prisoners should be allowed to wear their own clothing. All of their requests were denied, and so the women hunger struck. Hundreds of women hunger struck. Alice Paul, who had so far, she was organizing the pickets, but she was not participating in the pickets because she knew she was such a divisive character, and she didn't want it to be about her. She wanted it to be about the hundreds of women who were coming from around the country. She did join the picket line so that she could get arrested and sent to prison with her fellow suffragists. And she was separated and held in solitary confinement. And as she was hunger-struck, they sent her to mandatory psychiatric treatment. They wanted a psychiatrist to say that she was insane so that could be used to undermine the cause of the suffragists. The psychiatrist came back and said, she is not insane. I am not going to say that she is. She is just one of the most determined people I have ever met, but she is not crazy. And so then they began a system of force feeding by shoving tubes down the women's throats, often quite violently, chipping teeth and doing other things, feeding them some combination of milk, gruel, and raw eggs, which often made the women violently ill. So after having something shoved down their throat, they would be vomiting it back up, and to the great detriment of their personal health. Word leaked out of their treatment, and there was huge moral outrage at the torture that was being done. And the women were eventually released from prison. Some of them were so ill from the treatment, the hunger striking, the force feedings, that they had to be carried out on stretchers. Some were delirious with fevers. But all of them who had been arrested on the same charge, which was obstructing traffic, had their charges dropped, and they were released without prison records. And this really then led to a shift in momentum as a result of this. And even though Carrie, Chapman, Catt, and Alice Paul were not friends, NASA and Carrie, Chapman, Catt really benefited from the militancy of Alice Paul's wing, which was far smaller in terms of its numbers of members than NASA was. And this is pretty classic in terms of American social movement strategy. You have your mainstream large organization, and then you've got your crazy militants. And the crazy militants out there make your mainstream organization not look radical, but look reasonable. And so it gives those mainstream folks access to corridors of power and the ability to negotiate and move forward on the agenda because, by comparison, they look so normal and reasonable. Same thing with sort of like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. So exactly why was this an issue? Who would possibly object to the idea that women should be allowed the right to vote? Well, there were lots of people and lots of organizations that were in fact allied against suffrage. So on the first hand, the very largest women's organization of the progressive era was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which still exists as an organization, but temperance, in other words, prohibition, was a huge cause. And once the temperance movement merged with the suffrage movement, the argument became, if women get the right to vote, we'll get rid of the devil liquor. And all the problems that we have with domestic violence and child abuse and family neglect that they believe stems from the abuse of liquor and the unregulated liquor industry would be mitigated. And in fact, that happened. We passed a Prohibition Amendment, right? The Prohibition Amendment was passed with, very close in time to the Suffrage Amendment. Second was the women's trade union movement. There are a number of industries, especially the textile industries, that were dominated by women, and those women were organizing for 8-hour work days, mandatory break time, and so forth, a whole variety of protective legislation for workers. Other progressives, such as in the peace movement, just the establishment of social work, so those that were on social reformers, immigration reformers, of a whole variety, those that were advocating political party reforms, also allied with women's suffrage on the argument that if women had the right to vote, they would be able to fix a whole variety of corruption and social ills. because they had so many powerful allies, that also meant that they drew powerful opponents, right? You can imagine the liquor industry was not really excited about the idea that there might be millions of women voting to regulate their industry. Same thing with any sort of corporate barons. The Roman Catholic Church, which was very important, especially in New England, Texas, Louisiana, and some other pockets of the country, opposed this on the basis of undermining the home and the family. And then there were a whole variety of traditionalists, men and women, who opposed this. Importantly, the South was rather solidly against the idea of women's suffrage. And all of these arguments were there too, in a way, but they were really, really footnotes to the big objection that Southerners had of this, which was that enfranchising women would enfranchise African American women, and those African American women would then vote to undermine white supremacy. So the argument against suffrage in the South was that suffrage would undermine white supremacy. The argument in favor of women's suffrage in the South was that women's suffrage would uphold white supremacy. And if you really want me to dive into the logic behind those two arguments, I can, but it would take us off on a bit of a tangent. So all right, so in order to pass a constitutional amendment, it has to pass the U.S. House of Representatives by a 2/3 vote, the Senate by 2/3 vote, and then be ratified by 3/4 of the states, which at the time was 36 states. It passed the U.S. House of Representatives by 1 vote. And of those included one man who was brought in from the hospital on a stretcher so that he could vote in favor of the suffrage amendment. There was another advocate who had broken his clavicle, and he refused to have it set until after he cast his vote because he did not want to be on morphine and unable to sort of concentrate or even be awake. So he wanted to be present and alert. And a third who left the sick bed of his dying wife in New York to take the train down to vote for suffrage, and then turned around and returned to plan her funeral. So it was a very, very close thing, and it was almost not passed. The Senate, it passed by 2 votes, and then was moving through the states. Because some of the states in the Northeast and in the sort of mid-Atlantic region, specifically Delaware, had refused to ratify the amendment. That meant that the final debate came down to the state of Tennessee. And if Tennessee did not ratify, chances were very good that the amendment would have failed, because the remaining states who had to consider it still were all in the Deep South and were rather solidly opposed to the amendment. The Tennessee Senate passed fairly quickly and by a comfortable margin, but the House took longer to get organized, and in that process, both massive numbers of suffrage supporters and suffrage opponents sort of descended on Nashville, Tennessee, and both the Nassau organization and Carrie, Chapman, Catt set up their headquarters in the Hermitage Hotel, as did the leading anti-suffrage organization. The suffragists used the yellow rose as their symbol, and they would hand out yellow rose boutonnieres to the legislators who were their supporters so that they could be identified. The anti-suffragists did the same thing with the red rose. And the buttonholing, the literal and figurative buttonholing, was so intense that some of the legislators walked around with both colored boutonnieres in their pockets and would slip in the right color whenever they saw a lobbyist come by, so that they wouldn't have to have yet another conversation about why yes or why no. On the day of the vote, the suffragists and the anti-suffragists actually believed that the amendment was going to fail. They had all done their vote counting, and they believed that they were short by a vote. And so there was a fair amount of despondency on the part of Carrie, Catt, and her colleagues. And then, quite by surprise, a young man, 24 years old, member of the House, named Harry Byrne, switched his vote and voted aye. He voted aye, yes, even as he was wearing a red rose as an anti-suffragist. And it took a moment for people to realize what had happened. And afterwards, he was asked why he changed his vote. And that morning, he had received a letter from his mother. And his mother said, "Harry, be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification." Now, what I think is amazing about that story on a whole lot of levels is how close we came to not having the 19th Amendment ratified, right? It passed by one vote in the House, by just 2 votes in the Senate, and down to 1 vote in the last state, politically feasible state, in order for that to be ratified. And if it hadn't been ratified in 1920, it probably wouldn't have been ratified for another 50 years. So after that, what did the suffragists expect? Carrie Catt knew that women were not going to be accustomed to voting and would need some education on how to be good voters. So she founded the National League of Women Voters on February 14th in 1920 in anticipation that the amendment was going to be ratified. And suffragists anticipated that women would turn out in high percentages and that women would actually block vote, and they would vote in favor of all of these various social reforms. In fact, that didn't really happen. And in the first several iterations, women did not vote differently from men. They did not turn out to vote in very high rates. Now, most states at the time did not track voters by sex, but we can kind of tell by the numbers, you know, the increase in 1920 over 1916 in terms of just the sheer number of voters. And we can find that in some places there was as little as a 4% increase in the number of voters. So that does not, so unless men set out in large numbers, that women were just not turning out in high rates. And some women were still, of course, prohibited from voting, even with the 19th Amendment. The voter registration deadline had already passed in 1920 in the state of Mississippi, and the election official refused to reopen registration. So no women, white or black, voted in Mississippi in 1920. African American women living outside the South were in fact enfranchised due to the 19th Amendment, but African American women in the Deep South were not. They were still disenfranchised due to the various Jim Crow legislation that was in place. And other women of color were disenfranchised or continued to be disenfranchised for other reasons. So fast forward 100 years, right? What do we see here in 2020 that's different than what was going on in 1920? So first of all, in terms of voting, there's a lot of good news. Carrie Catt, if she came back from the dead, would be fairly pleased to look at some of this. So first of all, women became the majority of voters starting in 1964, the numerical majority of voters. So even because women are a majority of the voting age population, they could be a majority of the voters even if they still voted at lower rates than did men, which is exactly what happened in 1964. Women, of course, have continued to be a majority of the voters, and in 2016, nearly 10 million more women than men cast votes, which is a lot, right? The population of Iowa was 3.1 million, so we're looking at 3 times the population of Iowa. More women than men starting in the 1970s have been registered to vote. So again, we see about a 10 million voter difference in terms of registration. And starting in 1980, we see that women are voting at higher rates. So not only are they a numerical majority, but they are more likely to vote. So voter turnout in 2016 was 63% of women, 59% of men. So that's a significant difference. We also see starting in 1980 that there is a difference in how women vote, and we refer to this as the gender gap. So this is a little bit hard sometimes when I'm talking to students about it, so let me walk you through it. If there is no gender gap, we would expect that the percentage of men voting for candidate A would be, and the percentage of women voting for candidate A would be the same as the overall total voting for candidate A. That would be no difference on the basis of gender. What we see over here is what we would call a 4-point gender gap, with women favoring candidate A at a higher percentage than are men. So how does this play out? It plays out as a preference for Democratic candidates and the Democratic Party among women. And in 1996, when Bob Dole was running for president, and this was by this time a pretty pervasive pattern, he was asked what he was going to do as the Republican nominee to overcome the gender gap. And he said, well, I realize the Republican Party has a problem with women voters, but the Democratic Party has a problem with men voters. He's absolutely right. The problem is for the Republicans is that there are so many more women voters than there are men, that it's a bigger problem for them to see this gender gap. We see this gender gap in party preference is pervasive in any partisan election that we can track. So Senate races, House races, presidential races, state legislative races, gubernatorial races. It's just a question of magnitude. It is durable across race, education levels, region of the country. Again, it's just an issue of magnitude. We also see a gender gap in presidential approval, and we see it in public opinion polls on a whole host of issues, but especially social welfare issues. Women are more likely to support public spending for education, child care, health care, social welfare, food stamps, any of those things. Now, that does not imply unanimity, right? So if we look here, there's still a lot of women who voted for candidate B. So if we pretend that candidate B is a Republican, that means that there's still a lot of Republican women who don't necessarily agree with these patterns or might deviate from the patterns. But the patterns are strong and pervasive all the same. So if you are constructing a picture in your head of typical voter in the United States, whatever you make that picture out to be, that picture should be female. Okay. Now, having said that, women are also more likely to, by the way, join civic organizations, and there aren't very many people in the country who will actually engage in social protest, but of those who do, they are disproportionately women. Any other way that we as political scientists measure political activity, however, it appears that men are more likely to engage in all of these other political activities than are women. Now, I placed an asterisk next to donating money because there seems to be some hints that that's changing. Historically, men have been more likely to donate money to political candidates and have been more likely to donate larger sums. Now it appears that in terms of at least the act of donating, without looking at the amounts, that gender gap is narrowing. But men still have more access to family finances, greater disposable income, and will have more money at their disposal to be able to donate to candidates. So what is the upshot of all of this? Women remain underrepresented in public life, and you see the array of statistics there. In terms of the percentage on the Supreme Court, that's an all-time historic high. In terms of percentages of state legislators or those in the U.S. Congress, those are all-time highs. And in terms of service on Iowa boards and commissions is about a third. In terms of the presidential cabinet or governors, those are not historic highs. Those are somewhat lower than what they have been in the past, but only marginally, actually. So women remain largely underrepresented in public life. And why should we care, right? That's the big question. There's a couple of good reasons. One is that there's a whole raft of literature in the field of like organizational engineering and business and so forth that says that when you put together diverse groups of people, they are actually more productive. They are more productive because they have diversity of ideas, people think differently, and they reach a satisfactory conclusion to a problem faster than groups that are homogeneous. So you have a fairly compelling argument in terms of government of wanting more efficiency and more creative responses to public problems, right? So that would seem to be in a taxpayer's best interest. And in terms of political science, we measure democracy in a lot of different ways. And there's at least two, though arguably there are 10,000, ways that actually diversity is important in terms of the health of our democracy. One is what we call substantive representation. And the root of this word is substance, right? So in terms of issues or topics, when you have more women in public office, what we find is that the agenda changes. There are issues that are brought forward for consideration by legislative bodies that would not be brought forward without women at the table. And the same thing, of course, can be said for people of color, men or women. Descriptive representation is like holding up a mirror to society. One measure of a health of a democracy is to what degree do our elected and appointed officials look like the people that they govern. And if we have more diverse people in office, we have a healthier democracy and a more legitimate democracy because the democracy looks like the people who participate in the process. To explain the beautiful banner behind me, the Carrie Chapman Catt Center, the League of Women Voters, and a whole host of other organizations across Iowa, as President DeWinter had mentioned, are celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment throughout the year 2020 and starting a little bit in 2019, right? And these are some of the activities that are going to be happening statewide. And I won't read them to you, but you can see that they are sweeping and include public events, multimedia, school curricula, commemorative resolutions, and even activities at women's basketball games at the four-year colleges and universities. Go Cyclones. Okay. And I would like to personally invite you to the kickoff of these statewide celebrations, which will be on February 14th, which those of you who are still paying attention will remember is the anniversary of the founding of the League of Women Voters by Carrie Chapman Catt at Iowa State University. And we have a whole range of activities planned, including a screening of a documentary by Iowa Public Television, a campanile concert that will be nothing but suffrage songs that have been drawn from the Library of Congress. I've specifically asked that one of the items be a piece that is named for Amelia Bloomer, another prominent Iowa suffragist, as well as fashion warrior. And we will have replicas of suffrage artifacts on display, including a replica of the suffrage wagon used by Lucy Stone when she barnstormed for suffrage. We will have a keynote address on giving us more on the Tennessee battle by Elaine Weiss, who wrote the Women's Hour. And then the Yellow Rose of Suffrage will be performed by Dr. Jane Cox, where she plays Carrie Chapman Catt, and then a variety of food and drink and good times to be had by all. All of the events are free and open to the public, and I certainly hope that you'll be able to join us. Thank you for your wonderful and kind attention. I'm happy to take any questions. That's a great question. So the question is how active were suffragists in Iowa? And they were really fairly active. By the time that the suffrage debate was coming along in the late teens, Carrie Chapman Catt had moved to New York. But she would periodically come back to Iowa and organize folks. Iowa had one of the earliest organized suffrage parades in the town of Boone in 1908, and there are some marvelous pictures of this. And the woman who was president of Nassau in between the Catt years, Anna Howard Shaw, actually came to Iowa and participated. And we have been uncovering any number of Iowa suffragists who were active throughout the period. Mary Jane Coggeshall is one name that keeps coming up. But one of the things that we are looking to do as part of the centennial year is to identify and honor the contributions of some African American women suffragists who were very active before and during the suffrage movement and after the enactment. So, and women did not have the right to vote in Iowa before the suffrage amendment. So there had been some efforts to do it by state action in Iowa, but the process of amending the Iowa Constitution is fairly lengthy and complicated, and so it would just never get all the way through the process. So Iowa women were actually enfranchised by the 19th Amendment, so in 1920. And we do know that there were a few instances, like in Ames, there was a referendum in support of a public library, and the city council decided that for that one time they would allow women to vote on that referendum because the women had really been the driving force behind the idea of a public library. So there were a few local races that from time to time allowed women to vote, but it was not statewide, and it was not all races until after 1920. Yes? 1980. Yep. No, it's not. You know, it doesn't seem to have been triggered by any one thing in particular, but probably just the, you know, a lengthy sort of culmination of gradual change, and that it really became apparent and durable starting in 1980. That's a great question too. So the question is the impact of religion, and what I would say is there are certain religious denominations that have tended to support one party or another. I mean, interestingly enough, historically, Catholics were a voting bloc for the Democratic Party, even though that's not the association that many people would make now. And also in the late 70s and early 80s, what we found is that evangelical Christians became more engaged in the political process. In terms of evangelical women, we find that they are reluctant to be engaged in the political process. They might vote, but some of them don't even do that, but they certainly eschew any other types of political activity or public service because they see it as taking away from their appropriate roles in the home and the family. What I think is more crucial, though, is that the United States is becoming secularized. So nationally, if we look overall nationally, there's about 30% regular church attendance, and it has been declining for decades. And I think as the United States becomes more secularized, we're going to find that the impact of religion is mitigated. And we also see a huge generational difference. So when we look at millennials, Gen X, Gen Y, that regular church attendance goes down. Even if those people profess to be spiritual or believers, they are not part of organized religion. And so I think then that what that would do is then mean that other factors would come into vote choice other than religion, and you would probably, I anticipate that the gender gap is not going to go away. It's going to remain. Great question. Yes? That's a great question. So the question, in case you couldn't hear it, is it one way that explains the changes in women's political participation, the other social changes that have opened up opportunities for women in professions and education and so forth? And yes, they are absolutely clearly tied. And what a lot of women's advocates expected was that as women moved into the professions that tended to be the resume builders of political activists, going into law or business and so forth, that as women moved into those fields, that they would then have the requisite qualifications to run for office and to be elected for office. That has happened much more slowly than what a lot of advocates would have hoped. And the reason for that is complicated. There are several reasons. One is that even as women have entered the workforce, even as women now have higher levels of educational attainment than men and boys at every single level, starting with high school. So women are a majority of high school graduates, college graduates, master's degree graduates, and even PhD and other doctoral holders. Women are the majority, which is really rather remarkable when you think at one point the reason for keeping women out of institutions of higher education was the concern that their brains would blow up. Not kidding. But even as women have entered professions, what we have not seen is a change in women taking on primary responsibilities for home and family. So what has meant is that women end up working a double shift, right? They go to work all day, and then they have to come home and make dinner and make sure that the kids get the homework done and pay the family bills and clean the house. And the degree that they're not doing that, it's not because the men in their lives are picking some up. They do pick up a little, but not everything that a woman gives up. So then they're hiring out help, which, is an answer. But it does not mean that women, it doesn't mean that home life has become as egalitarian as our work lives. The second thing, though, is that we know that when women run for public office, they are as likely as similarly situated men to be elected. So women incumbents enjoy the same benefits of incumbency as men incumbents and are just as likely to get reelected. Women who are challengers are no more likely to lose than men who are challengers. They are just as likely to win, which is not likely at all, right? And then open seat races, women are likely, just as likely as men in open seat races to run and to win when they run. So it's not that voters are biased against women candidates. So one of the explanations for why we have few women in public office is that women aren't running. And when we ask women why they're not running, one set of reasons has to do with their family responsibilities. And for a long time, what we would see is that women would enter public life when their children were in high school or out of the empty nest. Now we find that that is even problematic because women then end up having to care for elderly parents. So their family responsibilities don't go away, and those family responsibilities are a barrier to giving up time from the personal life for public service. The second thing is that women underestimate their own qualifications and readiness to run for office. So one of my favorite phrases in the textbook that I use is a quotation from one activist who says, "Every woman thinks she needs a PhD in economics to be able to read a spreadsheet. Any guy who owns a used car dealership thinks he can do it." And that rather clearly encapsulates what we hear from women all the time. I don't know enough. I don't know enough. I don't know if I can do this. I need to take a class. I need to do some more work. I need to study up. Whereas, the men are far more likely to say, sure, I can do that. I've got something to say. I've got a contribution to make, and be much more likely to self-nominate and get engaged in the process. Yeah, thank you. All right. I don't want to keep you any longer. It has been marvelous to talk with you. Thank you so much for being a fantastic audience, and I'm happy to hang out and chat with any of you individually for a while. Thank you so much.